So welcome to It's Not All About the Numbers, the leadership podcast that is not all about the numbers. My name is Chris and that is Mike.
Hey everyone.
And this is Matt Buck, Director of Drawnilism. Hi, Matt.
Hello, Chris. Hello, Mike.
And I am so pleased I got that right because I can't tell you how many times I've wanted to say Darwinism because it looks like it in my brain. You're nodding there.
We found very early in our life that people didn't know exactly what we did. And that was one of our very first big business pains. So we chose to invent a word that described somewhat what we did.
So how's everybody's week been?
The last few weeks have been pretty manic. This week has been a quieter week. I've been working on a project looking at a data platform, and the politics around that has been fascinating and interesting. And I've spent a bit of time following up with a few people on some things, which I think other people call business development. In that, I managed to go to South Wales for a couple of days. And in that trip, I managed to catch up with somebody, actually, Matt, that you know well, Alex Coley, who I used to work with at DEFRA. Yeah. And we spent an evening chatting over old times and the things that interest us around politics and the political machinations of the world. So it's been an interesting kind of like slightly quieter worky week, quite a lot of good, positive downtime week.
Sounds great. And Matt, how about yourself? What have you been up to?
It's been a very busy period, actually. Some work, obviously, of course, but also I'm doing some personal development training at the moment, which is lovely and a luxury and also, a burden at the same time because you have to make the extra time for it. And just to close on that, a particular business meeting, I was given a plant at the end of it, which was both unexpected and rather charming. But it was a really great simple way of planting the idea that the relationship needs nurturing.
A nice little visual aid, I would imagine. That must appeal to you hugely.
It did.
I'm 100% pinching that. 100%. That'll be pinched. What's the course you're doing, Matt?
I'm doing something which is, to its great credit, funded by the government, Help to Grow Management. Although we're quite a mature business, we've been going for well over 10 years, there are certain times in the business where you realise the change needs to be dynamic. And this is making me think of your very first introductory It's Not All About the Numbers podcast, where you were sharing your personal stories. And everyone's got a different reason or trigger point for a transformation or a change, and particularly an enduring one. And that would be the reason, I think.
It's funny you say that, actually, because I think there's a lot of people out there who could do with development when they're kind of later on in their career, but they sometimes think, oh, I shouldn't do that now because I'm too experienced for it. Or, what if I go on management training and I've been a manager for 10 years? It's like, what's everyone going to think? Hopefully they'll think, well, you're going to be a better manager rather than, what an idiot he's been for the last 10 years. On my week, I wasn't really able to do any personal development this week. I was far too busy on planning out a lot of content for what we do on the Gen CFO side. Had some great workshops with the team about what was most interesting, what was most kind of appealing to the academy audience that we had. That's helping us develop an awful lot of content for next year, which was great. I also sort of externally had a board meeting as a trustee. I'm on a remuneration committee for a very large charity, and that was quite interesting because it's the first time I've done it, and there was an awful lot of updating of sort of employment data and trends for next year, and it's great to kind of have that from experts rather than trying to sort of make it up as you go along. Especially even as a small business, it's good to get an insight into what the percentage pay rises might be next year, or how unhappy generally the workforce is, and you can sort of gauge it for yourself. So yeah, that was my week. So it sounds like we had a very productive week, which was fantastic. But I'm curious about you guys, right? Because you this first time I've met you, Matt, but you guys have known each other for a while.
So just to introduce that, so I asked Matt to come on the podcast after we've done a few, because I think exactly as you said in the introduction, Matt brings a different perspective. But I thought might be worth sharing how we first met. And it was back in the days when I worked at DEFRA, so probably eight-ish years ago now, a bit longer, maybe a bit longer than that. And we were working on a project in DEFRA, which effectively was to try and influence cultural change and release a whole heap of data that had previously been locked away as open data that anyone could use. And one of the things that I had found through other jobs and other experiences that I'd had is quite often you draw something out on a PowerPoint to kind of illustrate what a future state model might look like, or a future state organizational approach might look like. But having worked with in an IT department before and working in an IT department in DEFRA, I was worried that what would happen is once you drew it as a kind of wireframe with arrows, people think they can take away stuff and then just build it and say, oh, yeah, that box is one of these, this box is one of those, and that's how it flows together. So in terms of communicating the culture change that we were trying to get in DEFRA, I worked with Matt, and we spent quite a lot of time together sort of chatting through what we were trying to do. And the idea was that Matt would illustrate the change in a way which could not be built. So you wouldn't be able to pass it in front of an IT person and they say, oh yeah, that's a platform, I'll just build you one of them. It would look compelling to the people who needed to understand what we were trying to achieve, but it would also look impossible to build as a IT solution. And that's kind of where it started. And when I sort of came to you and we started having those conversations, what was it that sort of intrigued you or sort of excited you about that piece of work that we had there?
I mean, obviously there was the relative, prestige of what you were trying to do. I think, frankly, the difficulty of what you were doing, cultural change, behavioural change is a hard thing, and it's particularly hard inside technology, in which I'd had some experience in my previous career in journalism. What I remember most about the project is less the drawing. I remember the events, and I remember the things that grew out of it around engagement. And particularly, there was one tiny thing that popped up completely by accident, the DEFRA selfie. It was the age of the smartphone. It was just coming, and it went viral, at least inside DEFRA. And it built engagement into that piece that you've just spoken about, Mike, that cultural change and the idea of translating, which I understand about you and your work experience. And I think that's what I really took away. It's very rarely one thing.
What was the DEFRA selfie? I've got pictures of large nosed cows in being pushed forward.
So there was a series of storyboards that Matt drew out, and one of them was a picture, because we were talking about looking at DEFRA ourselves. So he drew a picture of somebody holding up a smartphone, taking a picture of themselves, and just put at the bottom #DEFRA selfie. Talk about government departments, and they're just like a monolith thing that people don't really understand. So we took the approach of using Twitter, as it was called back in the day, and using the DEFRA selfie hashtag to start taking pictures of ourselves at work. It's like, we're here, picture DEFRA selfie. And so the team started doing it. But what got traction was it ended up with ministers doing DEFRA selfies. The permanent secretary was doing DEFRA selfies and posting pictures of where they were, what they were doing, and it started to show the people that worked within DEFRA and the breadth of the work. So when we were engaging around data and data sharing, people started to understand, actually, this isn't all that DEFRA do. So whilst this might be my single point of engagement with the organisation, they've started to show me this breadth of stuff that they do.
And it was very interesting because it was tiny in quite a large project and quite a lot of drawing. And that was the nugget that helped unlock people's attention on a really serious program of transformation involving vast sums of money, endless time, lots of resources of human time, not so much money perhaps, but it was a real learning experience.
Well, what did it show people though? Was it that people were bought into it, or was it about creating momentum or support for what you were doing publicly?
all of the above, and it's all of that, but also the human face of it. So it's quite easy to point at an organization and say, oh, those buggers in that organization, blah, 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 blah. But actually, when you see the people and actually see, oh, no, actually, it's Mike. He's all right. I can see that he walks the dogs, and whilst he's out and about and what he's thinking about stuff, actually, it personalizes the project. It makes the work that you're trying to do seem more human. And given all of, it was all about communication. It was all about engagement and communication to try and persuade people to do things differently by role modeling something slightly different, and this openness. So this openness in sharing who you were and what you were doing mirrored the openness that was needed in sharing the data that you were in control of. And that came through in spades.
We were talking to Rachel Harris last week, who uses social media a huge amount. And we asked her whether, it was a professional thing to do, the whole use of social media. And it sounds like this is a great example of how it is an enabler. And actually, social media is probably part of everybody's job. And if you can show support and use it in this way, then it's a real power for good. Yeah. But this was 8 years ago as well, and government. So yes. I don't know. Why am I surprised that this happened?
It was definitely a risky activity, or it was seen as a risky activity. But I suppose that this is one of those things that needs to be looked at a little bit. So all civil servants have to abide by the Civil Service Code. So there are a set of rules of what you can and can't do and say. And some of that is about, you can't criticise the government, for example, because part of your job as a civil servant is to be impartial. So those rules about what you can and can't say in public exist. And civil servants, by and large, are absolutely brilliant at abiding by the Civil Service Code. So we just said that those are the rules that we're going to follow. So yes, we might be talking about the work that we do in public, but we'll be following the rules that have been set, and we won't do anything ridiculous. I mean, within this project, one of the things I'm actually personally most proud of is we managed to run an event at the Ordnance Survey, which was both internal and external. So with public sector representation, but with private companies involved. Matt did a lot of the work on the graphics for it, had logos and stuff. We'd had it all planned for months. And Theresa May called an election back then. And when she called an election, what usually happens is government shuts down and can't do any external activities. And we got permission from the PermSec then that we could continue on and run our events in that period where the government's not, the civil service aren't supposed to, traditionally don't do anything, following the Civil Service Code about impartiality, making sure that all of the people, public and private, complied by the rules to not say anything about it in public. And we had that event and ran that event over 2 days in Southampton, and it was amazing.
That hybrid nature, the inside and outside view, and the ability to do both, I think comes right back to where Mike started with that piece about the original work we did inside DEFRA, where there were IT charts all over the place with good reason, but finding a way to put that together with the humanization. And that's pretty much what Drawnilism does. It exists for knowledge transfer, and we were extremely lucky to have the experience. And
moving on to Matt and what you do a little bit more, because it sounds like, when you work together, what you did was really important to that sort of messaging and understanding and communication. And, I experienced this myself like a week ago with the Academy when Mike asked you to join as a co-host, and your response was to actually listen to the first episode and to draw what you heard. How did you go about producing that?
The first thing was, it was a clear purpose. And I think pretty much the first thing I drew was what your purpose was. You've got a transforming generation of chief financial officers, because of digital change, context. So the story was natural. You follow that. And then you got the individual purpose, your own, Chris and Mike's, and how they actually work together, hybrid again, in this particular context. After that, it's much simpler in a way and more interesting because we got your personal story. I started in finance. I was not that keen. It was a paraphrase, but
it's true.
And over time it changes.
Yeah.
So that's a pleasure. If you aren't interested in people in a people business, then you're going to be in, a difficult position. So recorded your story, recorded Mike's. He keeps some things very dark because I learned a few things. And obviously the time where I got to know Mike, best part of the decade ago. And then you finished off beautifully with really talking about purpose going forward. And so the structure was nice and I had time. Very often, if we're recording live, if I was recording this conversation live, things would be very fast and very sketchy. So my hands are off again.
When you say recording, you're drawing, right? So
Yeah.
you're creating a record of what's being said. How important is the story in it?
Yes, typically, you're forced to make spatial decisions, if you like, if you're thinking about a piece of paper or a digital screen or whatever, very, very quickly. People look at us and say, oh, drawing or drawnilism even. Actually, it's a process of spatial awareness, dynamic change, and most importantly of all, active listening.
And I think just picking in on that. So the thing that I've always found as well is, so you do the active listening and record it, but actually the processing that you're doing as well. So we talked about that drawing, the it's not all about the numbers drawing a week or so ago. And the thing that really resonated with me was your analysis of Chris and mine's different stories. And I don't know if you remember, you said about Chris's story.
Yeah.
It was like a journey, but then there was a moment, like a trigger moment of crisis, the fraud, which made you make a decision. And then your reflection on my journey, which was, and your words, I think, were you're very much more following your nose all the way through it. And that's how it's my career's felt. And I did play that back to you, Chris, and that seems right. And
yeah,
that's the bit that's always intrigued me about the work that you do, Matt, is not only are you recording it, you've got this kind of like privilege of analyzing it in a really different way, and you see things in a way that I just don't. And I really love that.
It is a privilege. And when we work on longer projects, like some of the ones we've done subsequently, there's an opportunity to deliver a lot more value from that, because it often unpacks some of the challenges that transformation change brings, and which have shown up in some of your early podcasts.
I love it. I love what you do, and I think it's really helpful. I suppose trying to talk to some of the leaders that are listening, how can they, this isn't meant to be a sales pitch, by the way, but I mean, like, how can they use this? Because there's a lot of talk at the moment about storytelling and communication and being authentic as a leader. It seems to operate in that space around, messaging.
Yeah. One of the great revelations really has been inevitably the sheer variety. In the early days when we were working mainly at events and very specifically event focused, we were working a lot on paper and things like Defra Selfie and all that could be very effective. Hashtags, the social media wave, that's changed over time. We do a lot more work now in longer term transformation projects. Very often there's a series of processes which are hybrid by their nature. There'll be a gathering phase where perhaps you're engaging with customers in the way that you would be with your masterclasses or your own teams. And we'll be recording that live. Then there'll be some outcomes which will perhaps help to synthesize further in more depth, higher quality. But the important thing about it is it's a living process. It's part of it. If it's dead, if it's a static thing like a plan for an IT transformation without involving people, you're not going to engage. And if the change is mission critical.
So do you think in that scenario that you just described, and thinking about Chris's question about the sort of senior leaders and stories and stuff like that, do you think that the process as well as the outputs is like a learning thing?
Yes, is the short answer. The longer answer is, when you're going through a communication revolution like the one we're still in, and with AI here now and liable to do things quite as transitional as the internet and the social media wave and all of it, we were all managing in an age of uncertainty. Always, our most important asset as a business tool is the ability for active listening in context, with the ability to then analyze or challenge.
This sort of takes me back to one of the comments in previous episodes around, and you made a great observation, I think, when one of our award winners was talking about the application process being actually really quite cathartic for the team and actually having it as a team exercise. And, you could look at sort of applying for an award as just a process, or you could see it, I think what you were saying was actually, if you ran that as a team, if you brought the people into that equation, then it's actually, a celebration of the team, and almost like the application form is just a nice to have. If it feels a bit similar here, it's like you're by doing these sorts of exercises, you are bringing people into the equation.
I think that there's multiple benefits. So you've got the process of creation. So one of the places where I've seen Matt work is at Open Data Camp. So that's an unconference, and Matt and team capture the conversations that are going on as they're going on. So effectively, there's a team of people talking about a topic that they've chosen themselves, and it's getting captured. So what you get is, in the art that comes out at the end, the key points as interpreted by Matt and team, in a way which is engaging, that you can take away, and almost that's a celebration of the event right there. It's a celebration that you've had those good conversations. So you could do exactly the same thing within a team or within an organization, for sure. With some of the work done for DEFRA, not only did we do not only did we do the stuff that we were talking about there, the sort of like the hard copy slow form, but we did do some unconference type activities as well. The event in Southampton had an element of that. And the most engaging thing post event was having that art up around the building in DEFRA, and seeing people look at it, because you could then start having a conversation with the person you saw looking at it about that thing. Quite often in finance transformation, digital transformation, you get sucked into jargon really quickly, and the jargon becomes really unengaging. And if you don't understand it, you get cut out of the conversation. The beauty of this is there's something visual there that brings you together. So you're having a conversation about something which you can both interpret. So it's that unlocker of a conversation that sometimes you don't get when you're locked into an expert jargon rich silo.
And it's brilliant work, which kind of leads me on to this question to you, Matt, specifically. It's like, why do you do what you do? I hear you've had to change your business recently. You've been working in the EU a bit as well.
If I went right back to the beginning, it was because drawing was a great way of understanding the world, and it still holds true now. So it's always been a purpose-led business. In our earlier careers, and certainly for myself, when I was using drawing, I was using it for singular purpose, typically for publication, for gratification, to educate, perhaps to amuse, perhaps to shock, all kinds of reasons.
So is it fair to say that you started off doing sort of Dilberts, and now you've moved up to higher ground, or were you never in that sort of world?
Mike will tell you, I'm sure, some of my stuff was a lot ruder than Dilbert.
And I'm curious about the work that you're doing in Europe at the moment, because I've worked across Europe, I've worked across the globe, and have you noticed any sort of cultural differences when you're doing this work? Obviously, you've done a lot in the UK, but is it universally kind of understood and accepted as an important thing to do?
It's a very sharp question. It's a very interesting question. When we were younger in our trade, there was always a perception that near Europe or continental Europe was much friendlier to drawing as a tool for humor, jokes, satire, all the things, and also much broader things, bande dessinée in French, comics, but more importantly, that also the exchange of information. So yeah, you're absolutely on it, and it's a much more welcoming culture to it. Interestingly, my colleague Alex is working this very weekend in Brussels, in the Museum of Comic Art, which if you're ever in Brussels, don't miss. It's marvelous, in a splendid old Art Deco building. Some of our very first proper customers, even before I met Mike, I think, were the cross-border, interestingly, programs of the European Union. Very much about stitching together or helping people stitch together things that had been rent asunder or broken in different ways over time.
Well, I feel like you set me up there, because it's not all about the numbers, Matt, is it?
Nicely finished.
Yeah, thank you. So really interesting, really interesting. And if anybody would like to come on as a speaker or ask questions on the podcast, we would be happy to ask those questions to the audience and try and answer them ourselves. So if you send an email to podcast@generationscfo.com or reach out to Mike or myself on LinkedIn, then we'll bring questions in. We had the Academy the other week, and I tried to find a question that was linked, and this is a genuine question from the Academy, and it was: finance and business speak different languages. What should we do? ? What do we do? How do we go about it? And Mike, I'll come to you first, then Matt, maybe you can sprinkle some Dilbert magic.
The thing that immediately goes through my head is over communicate. I've had a couple of conversations this week with people, and they're non-technical people working in a technical environment, and they've said, well, I don't really understand I don't really understand the stuff that's going on over there, but it's fine because I'm doing my bit over here. And it's like, no, you're part of the same project team, part of the same project. Actually, it's fundamentally important you understand what's going on over there and what's going on over here. And I think this question's leading to the same kind of thing, which is, if you're in a business, you kind of need to understand what's being done in the business, right? So actually, it's everybody's job to be able to communicate with each other. So I need to be able to tell you what I'm doing in my expert area in a way that you can understand, and vice versa. And I think that for me is the key bit is, if you don't understand, ask, and creating a culture where asking because you don't understand is okay. I've said, using my catchphrase again, which I'm not allowed to use because of Ivanka, that I'm not an accountant. Working with you, Chris, there's so many times I don't really understand the conversation if it goes technical finance, but I ask. I just say, I don't get that. I've learned to ask. So that would be my advice. Ask.
We recently did a series of workshops for an investment bank, and they had all of these challenges. Particularly, we're having challenges with staff retention, and a lot of that is based around traditional models of working, which are quite siloed and not having any horizontal knowledge of the business. But the cultural piece is massively underestimated in terms of contextual understanding, and they did it through stories. People from each department were telling a story. And it wouldn't be complicated, not too much jargon.
I think that I just to draw one bit out that you just said there, Matt, which is that the continual loop.
Yeah,
it doesn't end.
No.
You have to keep talking and listening and talking and listening and creating those kind of roots. And if you don't carry on, then the silos reinforce themselves.
We're going to move on to good data, bad data. So this is something that we do every week, just to sort of fly through some good data that we found, some bad data that we found. And the first one's quite an interesting one. That we could go down a whole rabbit hole on this one, particularly with Matt on this episode. But I've put this into good data. McKinsey have basically said that the whole world's gone mad for Gen AI, and they are estimating the Gen AI economy is going to be somewhere between $2.6 trillion and $4.4 trillion annually across 63 use cases that they've come up with. And just to put that into perspective, that is about the size of the UK GDP in 2021. So it's almost like this whole economy and enterprise is popping up out of nowhere. I put that in good data, but Matt, I've got to ask, because you're on, like, what's your take as someone who's in that creative industry on Gen AI?
It's here. There's no getting away from it. Everyone thinks it's going to make their life easier because it's going to be faster. And in many ways, it will be easier because things can go faster. But speed kills as well. And there will be other areas and things that won't benefit from it at all. And I'm thinking beyond probably the subject of this, particularly in terms of misinformation, disinformation. It's you've seen already, perfect audio fakes of people's voices.
So we talked about this a little bit on previous episodes where people have won awards, digital fine art awards, by using Gen AI, and is it seen as cheating? And I think Mike was talking about Keir Starmer,
Yeah.
and how he was deep faked recently.
Yeah. Well, there was one this past weekend, and it was Sadiq Khan was deep faked.
That's right.
In advance of the stuff going on at the Cenotaph. It was
and it was funny. I was talking on a podcast last week called
another podcast. Hang on.
Someone else's. Yeah, we're all a family. We're all a family. Grassroots podcasting. And funnily enough, he picked up on the point that you made. I basically said something like, look, if you're competing on speed, the Gen AI is always going to win, right?
Yeah.
And you just said it lovely there, speed kills. And you can't compete on speed. So what is the magic humanness that you're bringing, Mike?
So I saw a quote around this, which was a Deloitte survey, and it said that the Deloitte survey is that 79% of CEOs believe Gen AI will increase efficiencies, and 52% believe it will increase growth opportunities. Is a quote from a Deloitte report this summer. And what went through my head when I read that quote, and it's kind of underpinned a little bit, is I wonder if we even know what we mean by Gen AI and how it's gonna impact. So a CEO saying, yeah, it'll increase efficiencies, they've got no clue. We've got no clue what's coming and how it's coming, just seeing what's happened in the last 12 months. And I think that to the point, it's almost like we can leap in straight away, or we just look, watch, observe, and onboard Gen AI in a more kind of like deliberative manner. And I think that's the bit for me. It's being deliberative and making conscious decisions, not accidental decisions about how to deploy some of this stuff.
I think what we're seeing here is that good data, bad data, there's two sides to every statement here. Because like you say, Mike, some people might be very pro all of this development. And, the other good data that I highlighted was similar CFO survey from Deloitte saying that 86% of CFOs were reporting that their understanding of AI and its uses has increased, right? So it's like, but what does that mean? And that 54% are optimistic about using it to improve business performance. Okay, but what does that mean? I think one of the biggest problems that we got here is there isn't a common language, right? Which kind of goes back to your point around finding one. Bad data.
Yeah, I saw a thing in The Guardian, and you'd have seen it. It was in the media around a company called Biobank who have been gathering our data on us that people have agreed to provide for medical research. So it's basically GP type data that have been provided in for medical research. And there's a bit of a scandal because it's been revealed that between 2020 and 2023, they've been selling access to this data to insurance companies. And there's kind of, I immediately went down a path from my background in live data licensing and stuff like that. And for me, this is a real story about the small print. So people assume when you provide data for research that that's a non-commercial public good. Yeah, you can do research, but actually there's a whole heap of companies that do research, and insurance companies do research. So basically, whilst the story is a scandal, actually everybody had given permission for Biobank to do what they did because they were selling data to insurance companies for the insurance companies to do research, which may not have been what was intended, but it certainly was seemed to be permitted in the small print.
Did I see that it was a very old story? The data, this had been happening for years. It wasn't just recent, since 2006, as far back as that.
Yeah, I didn't pick up that date, but it definitely didn't seem to be new news for sure. Yeah. It's just very much, I remember back in the Environment Agency, we had these debates about, when we were still selling data for reuse, it was very much, okay, so you can use it free for non-commercial use, but you have to pay for it if you're doing commercial things. How do you make that distinction? How do you make the distinction, the true distinction between commercial and non-commercial? Is it by organization? Is it by activity? It's very difficult. And I think this is a case in point.
Excellent. Well, a great debate. And we're still yet to find a ton of good data to balance out the bad data. And it seems like all the good data has got two sides to it. So we'll keep working. But it's been great to see that some of the audience actually who have been listening have been hashtagging good and bad data. So if you find any good data or if you find any bad data, then why don't you hashtag it with good data, bad data, and send it on to Mike and me, or podcast@generationcfo.com if you're that way inclined as well. But look, Matt, it's been really interesting to talk to you. I think your work is fantastic. I think there's so much to it as well, which I didn't first appreciate, if I'm being really honest. I've been in workshops in the past where someone has provided something like this, but it's the use of it, and it's the further use of it, and it's taking people on a journey that seems to be super important. So thank you for being part of this today. And where can people find you, Matt?
We live online at Drawnilism, so just like Gen's CFO.
Excellent. So if you put in Drawnilism, which is DRAWNALISM, not Darwinism.
Beautifully pronounced.
You will find it, and it's Matt Buck. So, Mike, thanks again, and we'll see you next time. And remember, it's not all about the numbers.